In this demo, I'm going to create a new virtual machine, then we're going to install an operating system on the virtual machine. My computer already has the Hyper-V role installed, so I'm going to open my Hyper-V Manager, which I have pinned on my taskbar here at the bottom. In the Hyper-V Manager, I'm going to go over to New Virtual Machine. I'm going to click Next on this before you begin. For the name of the new virtual machine, I'm going to name it RTS-DC1. Now that name is actually not significant. That is not the same as the actual computer name. So once we install an operating system, I have to then go back after the operating system has installed and I've named the computer whatever I want. So the name of the virtual machine and the name of the computer are two different things. Although it's pretty common you name them the same thing, but you'd manually have to do that. It does not carry over. We do have a module that covers Hyper-V in detail that comes up in this course. For now, we just want to look at some of the options creating the virtual machine, but we won't go into a lot of detail right now. There is an option to store the virtual machine in a different location. It's in this C Program Data Microsoft Windows Hyper-V. That is the location we want it in. So we're not changing that, but you could browse out to a different location. We're not doing that though. When I click Next, it brings me up to the generation. We will always choose Generation 2. This tells us the virtual machine generation provides support for newer virtualization features. Many of those are security related, and it requires a 64-bit operating system. So it's more secure and more efficient overall. Generation 1 is for legacy virtual machines. It supports 32 and 64-bit operating systems. But if your virtual machines run Windows Server 2012 R2 or newer, then you would always choose Generation 2. On the client side, Windows 8.1 and newer, you would always choose Generation 2. Assign memory. I'm going to leave this on 4,096 megabytes, which is 4 gigabytes of memory. But do notice this says startup memory. So the computer starts up, has 4 gigs of RAM automatically assigned to it. But below that, it says use dynamic memory for this virtual machine. So the way this works right now, the virtual machine uses 4 gigs of RAM to start up. After it starts up, if there is not a demand for resources, it can drop below that 4,096 megabytes. It can drop all the way down to about 1 gig if you don't have any additional services actually running. This being dynamic means it will just dynamically increase and decrease as load on your server actually changes. So in a lab environment, we always want to use dynamic memory. I'm going to say next for that. We have not configured anything related to networking yet. So for now, I'm going to leave this connection on not connected. And I'll go next. For the configure virtual hard disk, you have 3 options. Create a virtual hard disk. Notice the name of the virtual hard disk is the same as the name of the virtual machine, and it has this .vhdx extension behind it. All Microsoft virtual hard drives now have a .vhdx extension. The location, C Program Data. I'm not changing that either. The size will be 127 gigabytes by default. Now that's not a concern. The reason it's not a concern is these are dynamic disks, meaning they are only as large as the amount of data you've saved, but it will never exceed this number. So when this is installed, it's going to be just above 10 gigabytes, the operating system, but it'll never grow beyond 127 gigabytes. So don't be concerned thinking that's going to consume all the space on your machine. It will not. There's also an option to use an existing virtual hard disk, but we are creating our very first ever, so we can't choose that. And there's an option to attach a virtual hard disk later if you want to do that. We're going to leave it on create a new virtual hard disk and go next. The last question is the operating system. Install an operating system later or install an operating system now. You can just browse. This is the ISO file that I've actually downloaded. I actually have a few. I have a Windows Server 2016, Windows Server 2022. 2022 is what we want. So I'll just choose that ISO file and we are done. Now, it does seem odd that you can install an operating system later and you can attach a disk later. The reason those options that give you the later show up, you may be in an environment where you have virtualization administrators. They manage creating all the resources within your virtualization platform like Hyper-V. Someone else may install the operating system. So maybe one of my database administrators, they want a new virtual machine and they're going to test some database settings in this new virtual machine. Well, we may not give them access to Hyper-V in our environment. They can manage the virtual machine, even install the operating system possibly, but they cannot go through and decide what disk size, how much memory the virtual machine should have. So kind of that separation of responsibilities is why they give us some of these options here. But we'll just choose next, and that's done. So we'll finish. And now I have my new virtual machine. Pretty awesome. On the networking side, there is a virtual switch manager. When I go to Virtual Switch Manager, I have 3 types of virtual switches that I can create. One is external. If I want this virtual machine I just created to connect to the internet, connect to resources on the network, you would have to choose external. When we look at the description, it does tell us it creates a virtual switch that binds to the physical network adapter so the virtual machine can access the physical network. That is the only option that will get you network connectivity, whether that's to your network or if you want to connect out to the internet, have to choose external. If I click create for the external, there is an option here to choose my network adapter. The computer I'm using right now has 2 network adapters. One is an Ethernet and the other is wireless. So whichever of those you want the virtual machine to ultimately be connected to, that's what you would actually choose from this list. So that is one option. I'm going to click remove. If not, this will just stay in the list here. But if I go back to new virtual switch, we also have private. This tells us it creates a virtual switch that can be used only by virtual machines that run on this physical computer. What that means, if you choose private and you create other virtual machines, this virtual machine is RTS-DC1. If I add 3 more virtual machines and I connect them all to this private switch here, then they can talk to each other, but that's it. They can only communicate with each other, so they will have isolation within the network. They won't be able to connect to the internet or other network resources. The internal, it starts off the same as private. Creates a virtual switch that can be used only by virtual machines that run on this physical computer. So VMs that use this same internal network can talk to each other. But then it goes on to say, and between the virtual machines and the physical computer. So now you can connect to the host computer, meaning the host computer I'm using here. Let's say on the desktop of this machine, if I were to create a new folder and then I share the folder, if you are on this internal switch, you could browse that shared folder on the host computer, assuming you have the correct permissions assigned. If we choose private, that is not an option. You would never have connectivity to the actual host, just to VMs on the host. So those are the 3 choices. Private, you can only talk to other VMs. Internal, you can talk to other VMs and you can talk to the host. External, you can talk to everything. You can talk to VMs, you can talk to the host, the network, and you can even get out to the internet. I'm going to choose external and I'm going to click create a virtual switch. And I'm going to put this on my Ethernet controller instead of my wireless. So I'll make sure my Ethernet is selected, which it is, and we will just click OK. It does tell me this may disrupt network connectivity. It actually will disrupt network connectivity because the network adapter itself has to briefly reset. So if you're downloading something right now to this machine, not the best time to create a new external switch. But I'm going to say yes for that. Now that is done, we have our virtual switch. What I'm going to do is go to the virtual machine we just created. I'm going to right click and go to settings. And under settings here, I have this network adapter not connected because we didn't connect it when we created the virtual machine. I'm going to go to not connected And I'm going to choose the new virtual switch. And I'm going to choose OK. Now, there was one thing I didn't do, which is very forgiving. But if I go back to the virtual switch manager, I can see it says new virtual switch. Then it has that killer E3000 gigabit Ethernet. Well, I'm going to click on that. I don't want it named new virtual switch because that's not descriptive. So I'm going to name it external. At any time, you can rename any of these. Normally, what I do in a lab environment is I will have an external. If it's going to be private, I just name it private. And I'm going to click OK for that, and that's been renamed. Now, if I go back to the settings of the virtual machine itself, you'll see that name is reflected here. So you're not reassigning or anything like that. So that is on my external switch, that virtual machine. When the operating system's installed, it will have internet access.